Welcome to the first episode of Commander Food Fight Deck Tech. Today we're going to be covering the joyous jank that is known as Saga Tribal. If you watched our recent gameplay video, you saw me pilot this deck against the powerhouse of Perforos, Kaikar, as well as Akiri and Bruce Tarl. This deck is designed to be a stealth deck, flying under the radar until it's too late for your opponents to do anything about it. If you love a deck that is designed around the politics of Commander, this deck might be just what you're looking for. I'm going to break down this deck for you, showing you the key cards and the ways that we can win. Complete deck list will be in the description below. Most Commander decks are designed around their command. In this deck, we actually are designed around the cards within the deck, those being the powerful sagas that have been recently introduced. So let's kick this off. I have chosen Golos, Tireless Pilgrim, as the commander for this deck. Golos is a 5 CMC legendary artifact creature that reads, when Golos, Tireless Pilgrim, enters a battlefield, you may search your library for a land card. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. And he has an activated ability of 2 in Wooburg. Exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn without paying their mana costs. Now, we're not really too concerned about the first text box. There's only one utility land we're really worried about, Hall of Heliod's Generosity, but it is still nice to use it as a ramp. The second ability is really handy, especially when you're running low on resources. A 5-color deck can be very tricky to build around. You want to get all of your colors as fast as possible. We do have some artifact and enchantment-based ramp, cards like Mind Stone, Commander's Fear, Arcane Signet, Wayfarer's Bauble, and Soul Ring. Those are all great cards that we can use to get going quicker. We also have Wild Growth, Urban Utopia, and Fertile Ground. Those are 3 great spells that have the ability to draw us cards if we have other pieces in place. I don't run a lot of creatures in this deck because our main win con are the enchantments themselves. But there are several creatures that we really want to run. Some, like Starfield Mystic and Herald of the Pantheon, reduce the cost of our enchantments and give other benefits. With Starfield Mystic, whenever an enchantment you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you put a 1/1 counter on Starfield Mystic. This creature can get very large and out of control very quickly. Herald of the Pantheon not only reduces the cost of your enchantments, but you gain a life whenever you cast one. That's a great thing to have, especially since most of our action happens mid to late game. Cards like Destiny Spinner, that give creatures and enchantment spells we control can't be countered, is a great creature to have on hand if you have a lot of control decks in your meta. For 3 and a green, you can also turn a target land into an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is the number of enchantments you control. It's still a land. That's also another great way to close out a game. We have several creatures that act as Enchantress, drawing us cards whenever we cast an enchantment or have one enter the battlefield. Satyr Enchanter, Enchantress Presence, Eidolon of Blossoms, and Mesa Enchantress all give us great card advantage. The remaining creatures give great support for our deck. The always popular Solemn Simulacrum is a great way to ramp as well as card advantage when it dies. Faboral Elder is a must in 5-color decks as it often taps for 5 mana. It is a great way to have extra mana late in the game. Dockside Extortionist is a great card to also provide ramp. Our last 2 creatures, Brago King of Turnal, which is a legendary creature spirit for 2 generic and a white and blue. Whenever Brago, King Eternal, deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. This is incredibly powerful with our deck, as it allows us the ability to blink any of our enchantments that we want to reset. Archon of Sun's Grace, which is a creature, Archon, 2 and 2 white, for a flying lifelink 3/4. Pegasus creatures you control have lifelink, and it has Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters a battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. Yet another way for us to close out games. We are generally using our enchantments to control the board. We do run some interaction in the form of Chaos Warp, Swords to Plowshares, and Utter End. Great removal spells that handle most threats your opponents will throw your way. I built this deck so that it can be fun to play with and fun to play against. I do run some tutors in Idyllic Tutor as well as Plea for Guidance. Those both search your deck for enchantment cards and put them into your hand. Plea for Guidance at 5 generic and 1 white searches for 2 cards and puts those into your hand. Now, you might be asking, what happens when we lose all of our enchantments, or the board gets wiped? Well, we have answers for that as well. Cards like Replenish, which is a 3 and a white, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to play, as well as Dance of the Manse, X, white and blue for a sorcery that reads, return up to X target artifact and or non-aura enchantment cards, each with converted mana cost X or less, from your graveyard to the battlefield. If X is 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creatures in addition to their other types. We run 3 planeswalkers. Calyx, Destiny's Hand, 2 in a green and white. For a legendary planeswalker Calyx, his +1 ability, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment card from among them and put that card into your hand. Put the rest at the bottom of your library in a random order. -3, exile target creature or enchantment you don't control until target enchantment you control leaves the battlefield. This is another great way to get rid of those pesky threats your opponents have. The -7, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, fits perfectly with the previous 2 cards, Replenish and Dance of the Manse. Amanatu the Fate Shifter, another planeswalker, a white, blue, and black. Her +1, draw a card, then put a card from your hand on top of the library. Her +1, draw a card, then put a card from your hand on top of your library. But the -1 is the one we're really concerned with. Exile another target permanent you own, then return it to the battlefield under your control. Just like Brago, this gives you a great way to manipulate your enchantments to reuse them, especially the powerful chapters. Estrid the Mask, a planeswalker, a generic green, white, and blue. The +2, untap each enchanted permanent you control. -1, create a white or enchantment token named Mask. The token has enchant permanent and totem armor. The -7, put the top 7 cards of your library into your graveyard. Return all non-aura enchantment cards from the graveyard to the battlefield. Then do the same for aura. Then do the same for aura cards. This planeswalker helps us in a number of ways, including ramp, as we can attach a mask to one of our land. And the minus ability helps us bring all of our enchantments back. We do have some non-saga enchantments that give us great utilities. Cards like Assemble the Legion, for 3 generic and Boros. It's an enchantment that reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, put a muster counter on Assemble the Legion. Then put a 1/1 red and white soldier creature token with haste onto the battlefield for each muster counter on Assemble the Legion. This is a great way for us to flood the board, not only with attackers, but also blockers. Sylvan Library, 2 in a green. Enchantment that reads, at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life and put that card on top of your library. This helps us early to filter, get lands as needed, or answer the board state. During the late game, it also helps us find exactly what we need to close it out. As this deck is designed for mid to late game, we have many cards that will help us get there. One of which, Authority of the Councils, is an enchantment for 1 white that reads, creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. When your opponents are running aggressive decks, this is what gets you to the late game. Rest in Peace is an enchantment for 1 generic and a white that reads, when Rest in Peace enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards. If a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. We do have to be careful with this enchantment as it does hit us, and a lot of times we want to get those enchantments back. But if your meta contains a lot of graveyard decks, this is a card that will save you more often than hurt you. Smothering Tithe, the white enchantment for 3 generic and a white that reads, whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. During our last gameplay video, when I piloted this deck, it was this enchantment that basically won the game for me. As I had missed several land drops early on, I was able to cast this enchantment just before we all had to wheel, netting me 21 tokens and allowing me to establish my board state the next turn. Mirari's Wake, an enchantment for 3 generic, green and white, reads, creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produces. In a 5-color deck, this is very important for us as mid to late game, it allows us to use our resources to pull ahead of our opponents. And when we finally do swing for lethal, it pumps all of our creatures. Ashiok's Eraser has saved me a number of times. It is an enchantment for flash for 2 generic and 2 blue that reads, when Ashiok's Erasure enters the battlefield, exile target spell. Your opponent can't cast spells with the same name as the exiled card. When Ashiok's Erasure leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to its owner's hand. Now note that this says target spell, not target creature, anything. If your opponent decides he wants to cast a very large gen wave, this is the perfect card to stop that. We have cards like Mirror Maid, 1 generic and 2 blue for an enchantment that reads, you may have Mirror Maid enter the battlefield as a copy of any artifact or enchantment on the battlefield. Now, if your opponents are running very powerful artifacts or enchantments, this is a great card to help give you more resources. You can also copy your own enchantments to be able to use those over and over again. Sphere of Safety, which is an enchantment for 4 generic and a white that reads, creatures can attack you or a planeswalker you control unless the controller plays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. For a deck like this, it basically should just read, you don't attack us, as we often have 5 to 10 enchantments out at any one point in time. Just like Mirror Mate, Estrid's Invocation, which is an enchantment for 2 generic and a blue, reads, you may have Estrid's Invocation enter the battlefield as a copy of any enchantment you control, except it gains at the beginning of your upkeep. You may exile this enchantment. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is one that I feel is even more powerful than Mirror Mate, because every upkeep you get to target a different enchantment. That gives you the flexibility to answer any new threats that were just put on the board. 2 of our strongest enchantments that also happen to be part of our win con. Sigil of the Empty Thrones, which is an enchantment for 3 generic and 2 white that reads, whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a 4/4 white angel creature token. In our deck designed to lay down enchantments over and over again, this quickly gets out of hand for your opponents. Starfield of Nyx, which is one of the most important enchantments in our deck. For 4 generic and a white, it reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. As long as you control 5 or more enchantments, each other non-aura enchantment you control is a creature in addition to its other type, and it has base power and base toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost. That means enchantments like Sigil of the Empty Throne becomes a 5/5 creature with a bunch of 4/4 angels to follow it along. Now there are 5 more legendary enchantments that I've always wanted to put into a deck. Each enchantment alone is not very powerful. But when you have multiple copies of these onto the battlefield at the same time, then they become great. And these are the 5 Hondens from the Kamigawa block. Honden of Infinite Rage, which is an enchantment for 2 generic and a red, reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, Honden of Infinite Rage deals damage to target creature or player equal to the number of shrines you control. Honden of Life's Web, 4 generic and a green, reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token onto the battlefield for each shrine you control. Honden of Night's Reach, 3 generic and a black, reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, target opponent discards a card for each shrine you control. Honden of Cleansing Fire, 3 generic and a white, reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 2 life for each shrine you control. And one of my favorites, Honden of Seeing Winds, 4 generic and a blue, reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card for each shrine you control. These cards individually are not very powerful, but when you get multiple shrines on the battlefield, they can very quickly take over a game. Now, sagas can be powerful, but what happens when we lose them? We have several ways in our deck to recur them that I went over earlier, but how about if we can manipulate these while they're still on the battlefield? We have 2 artifacts that do that for us. Power Conduit, for 2 generic, reads, tap, remove a counter from a permanent you control, choose 1, put a charge counter on target artifact, or put a 1/1 counter on target creature. This is a great way to take counters off of our enchantments and also buff up any of our creatures. We also run Hex Parasite, which is an artifact creature for 1 generic that reads X for Exian, remove up to X counters from target permanent. For each counter removed this way, Hex Parasite gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This allows us to reuse many of our enchantments, especially the very powerful chapters. Here it is, Spellslingers, time for you to see exactly what makes our deck so great, and that's the sagas. There are 17 sagas in this deck. I don't run every saga that's ever been printed because some of them are not very good for us. 2 of the red sagas as well as 1 of the white ones. As I mentioned, this deck is designed to fly under the radar, never posing a threat until it's too late. Because of that, there is 1 saga that I do not run, and that is Fall of the Thran. 5 generic and a white for a enchantment saga that reads, Chapter 1, destroy all land. Chapter 2 and 3, each player returns 2 land cards from their graveyard to the battlefield. Having something like this hit the battlefield makes you an enemy right off the bat, not only in the game, but after the game, and the games after that, because no one likes having all of their lands blown up. So here's a rundown of the enchantments that we run. The Mending of Dominaria. For 3 generic and 2 green, Chapter 1 and 2, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. Then you may return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is great late game as it allows us to find our creatures like Brago, Hex Parasite, or Archon of Sun's Grace to put up blockers and help reset any of our enchantments. Birth of Melitus, which is a generic and a white for a saga that reads, Chapter 1, search your library for a basic plains card. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. Chapter 2, create an 0/4 colorless artifact creature token with Defender. Chapter 3, gain 2 life. The second chapter is the one that we're really worried about. Chapter 1 is nice, but it only gets us a basic land. Chapter 2 gets us a wall, which is a great way to stay alive into the mid and late game. Rite of Belzenlock, 2 generic and 2 black for a saga that reads Chapter 1 and 2, create 2 0/1 black cleric creature tokens. Chapter 3, create a 6/6 black demon creature token with flying, trample, and at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice another creature. If you can't, this creature deals 6 damage to you. Late game, this gives us a great way to finish our opponents. Song of Freyleys, 1 generic and a green. Chapter 1 and 2, until your next turn, creatures you control gain tap, add 1 mana of any color. Chapter 3, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance, trample, and indestructible until end of turn. This enchantment gives us a great way to close out the game, as by the time we play this, we will hopefully have quite a few angels, as well as Pegasus and soldiers on the battlefield from our other creatures and enchantments. History of Benalia, 1 generic and 2 white for a saga that reads, Chapters 1 and 2, create a 2/2 white knight creature with token and vigilance. Chapter 3, creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. By being able to repeatedly blink, this gives us a board full of knights. Mirari Conjecture, 4 generic and a blue, for an enchantment saga that reads Chapter 1, return target instant card from your graveyard to your hand. Chapter 2, return target sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Chapter 3, until end of turn, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. We can use this to get back any of our removal or tutors from the graveyard. And when the time is right, it becomes a 5 power and toughness creature. Phyrexian Scriptures, 2 generic and 2 black, reads Chapter 1, put a 1/1 counter on up to 1 target creature. That creature becomes an artifact in addition to its other types. Chapter 2, destroy all non-artifact creatures. Chapter 3, exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. We don't run a lot of creatures in this deck, so this generally does not hurt us. This is a great way to board wipe and get rid of the threats for good. The Binding of the Titans, for 1 and a green. Chapter 1, each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. Chapter 2, exile up to 2 target cards from graveyard. For each creature card exiled this way, you gain a life. Chapter 3, return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. This is another great way to eliminate any threats that our opponents have in their graveyards. Madomai's Prophecy, for a generic and a blue. Chapter 1, scry 2. Chapter 2, choose a card name. Chapter 3, when you cast a spell with a chosen name for the first time, this turn, draw a card. Chapter 4, look at the top card of each player's library. This enchantment gives us great card selection, as well as card draw for casting our spells. Triumph of Gerard, a generic and a white. Chapters 1 and 2, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control with the greatest power. Chapter 3, target creature you control with greatest power gains flying, first strike, and lifelink until end of turn. Putting counters like these onto your angels is a great way to come back and gain some life. The Eldest Reborn, 4 generic and a black. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Chapter 2, each opponent discards a card. Chapter 3, put target creature or planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This enchantment gives us great removal, resource denial, as well as being able to take the biggest and scariest thing in anyone's graveyard and put it onto our field. The First Iroan Games, 2 generic and a green, for a saga that reads Chapter 1, create a 1/1 human soldier creature token. Chapter 2, put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creatures you control. Chapter 3, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw 2 cards. Chapter 4, create a gold token. Now we're generally worried about chapters 2 and 3, as we can stack these counters on top of any of our angels and then draw cards. Elspeth's Nightmare, 2 generic and a black. Chapter 1, destroy target creature an opponent controls with power 2 or less. Chapter 2, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature non-land card from it. That player discards that card. Chapter 3, exile target opponent's graveyard. Chapter 2 gives us the ability to look at our opponent's hands and find out if the coast is clear for a swing. Now for some of the most important sagas that we have. These are the sagas that we want to reuse as often as possible. Time of Ice, 3 generic and a blue. Chapters 1 and 2 read, tap target creature an opponent controls. It doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Time of Ice. Chapter 3, return all tapped creatures to their owner's hands. This is a great way to take the biggest threat on the battlefield and turn it sideways so that they can't block you when you swing for lethal. If you are able to copy this with Mirror Maid, or Estrid's Invocation, you're able to lock out your opponents from being able to play the game. Elspeth Conquers Death. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a saga that reads Chapter 1, exile target permanent and opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater. Chapter 2, non-creature spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast until your next turn. Chapter 3, return target creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter or a loyalty counter on it. This is a great way to deal with the biggest threat on the battlefield, being able to exile it and then protect you during your next turn by taxing your opponent's spells. Kiora Bests the Sea God. 5 generic and 2 blue for a saga that reads Chapter 1, create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token with hexproof. Chapter 2, tap all non-land permanents target opponent controls. They don't untap during their controller's next untap step. Chapter 3, gain control of target permanent and opponent controls. Untap it. Being able to put a giant 8/8 Kraken on the battlefield, tap all of your opponent's creatures, and swing in for big damage makes this saga incredibly powerful. Not to mention that when you animate it with Starfield of Nyx, it becomes a 7/7 beater. The Akroan War, 3 generic and a red, for a saga that reads Chapter 1, gain control of target creature for as long as the Akroan War remains on the battlefield. Chapter 2, until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able. Chapter 3, each tapped creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. This is a great way to get your opponent's creatures to kill them with, as well as tapping down their whole board. But you do have to be careful because you are making them attack, so if you leave yourself open, they can get some big damage. I love this deck because it allows me to remain under the radar. Never really a threat because I just have some enchantments on the battlefield. That is, until Starfield of Nyx comes out. So things you need to watch out for when you're playing a deck like this. While most decks don't have mass enchantment removal, they do have board wipes. Once Starfield of Nyx hits the board, all of your enchantments become vulnerable to a board wipe. So don't bring it out until it is time to end the game. If, like me, politics is one of your favorite part of a Commander game, this deck is perfect. With nothing but a few enchantments on the battlefield, everyone else is a lot more threatening. Let your opponents knock each other out, and then swing in for the game. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this deck. What changes would you make? Thank you, Spell Slingers. I hope you enjoyed this. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.